Common misconceptions about swords. Swords are heavy. Swords on average weighed closer to 2 to 3 pounds, not exactly what most people would call heavy. Now they're a bit unwieldy because of how levers work. They're essentially levers. This is 6 pounds. It's pretty easy to lift, it's 6 pounds. However, if you put that on the end of a lever, then it's it's harder to control. There's not really that much difference between European sword fighting and Asian sword fighting and anywhere else in the world. I mean, there are only so many ways that you can move the human body. Especially if you're holding something with 2 hands. There's only so much you can do. Swords can't cut through armor unless we're talking about cloth armor. You could thrust a sword through chain armor or gaps in plate armor, but slamming at any armor with a sword is generally not really going to yield to impressive results. Now there are ways you can make swords more effective, but generally the winner of an armored sword fight across the world was whoever turned it into a grappling match first and pulled out a more manageable knife or dagger. Swords broke all the time. It's a pretty common motif in medieval European art. It's pretty well known from Japan. It's an object breaks. People back then predominantly accepted that they were limited use items. That groove running down the middle of some swords is not a blood groove. It's not to depressurize the human body if you stab them. It's there essentially to reduce weight, kind of, but not really. More specifically, it's so that way you can have the same amount of material and widen it without, adding more material. So it gives you a wider blade without giving more weight, so it kind of makes it lighter. And modern smiths usually grind that in instead of making it during the forging process, so it is really to make it lighter. Katanas are both not magic swords that can cut through tanks and not super fragile bad swords that would break if you sneeze at them. They're made with slightly different techniques and have varying different qualities, like every single object. On average, the edge was made of harder steel, so it could hold an edge better, it could stay sharper for longer, but it would be slightly more prone to cracking. But this difference would be relatively insignificant in the grand scheme of things. Oh, and a lot of people say that Japanese swords were made of iron sand, which is really low quality, but like a lot of other places, Japan had multiple sources of iron. There is no best sword. There are just swords that are better than other swords at specific things. You could look at this German Zweihander and this European small sword, and the Zweihander seems like, it's a lot better. You might think that. Up until the point where you have to carry your sword around all day long. Then the small sword looks pretty good. Swords historically in warfare were pretty much sidearms. The weapon that you use if your main weapon breaks or gets lost. Now, some people use swords more than others, like the Landsknecht, the Romans, but those themselves were still in certain contexts. Landsknecht used Zweihanders in order to support pike formations, and the Romans did use a sword, but that was often in conjunction with their shields and their spears. It's honestly difficult for me to say that the sword was their main weapon because they could have just used any sword, and their tactics would have been pretty much the same. But if they had a different shield, their tactics would change drastically. If they had a different spear besides the pilum, their tactic would change drastically. But in general, swords were sidearms. Up until a civilian context when a lot of people carried them for self-defense.